Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. I am standing in Johnson Square in downtown Savannah on a beautiful October afternoon, much like the one at Yorktown, Virginia on October 19th, 1781, 241 years ago, when General Washington received the surrender of Lord Cornwallis and the British Army, effectively ending the military phase of the American Revolution. Now, I'm standing right here in Johnson Square because right over my left shoulder, as you can see, is the monument and the grave to General Nathaniel Greene, who played an instrumental part in what happened during that campaign at Yorktown. Nathaniel Greene wasn't there, but the previous March, 7 months earlier, he had fought Cornwallis at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, and even though technically it was a British victory, Cornwallis took his army north into Virginia, out of North Carolina, and decided eventually to land in Yorktown and await transport and supplies from the British Army under Sir Henry Clinton in New York City. Now, Virginia was lightly defended, about 4,000 troops under the Marquis de Lafayette. General Mad Anthony Wayne was there, as was Baron von Steuben. Cornwallis decided to make a stand right there on the promontory at Yorktown. Meanwhile, General Washington had his army outside New York, farther north, where he had been since 1778. The British had occupied New York since 1776. Washington wanted to lay siege to New York. He had been itching for years to attack the city of New York and drive the British out. Now, by 1781, the French had been our allies for about 4 years, and there was a French army here in the States under Count Rochambeau. He advised Washington to go south and fight Cornwallis down the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. Rochambeau had also received word from Admiral de Grasse, the French naval commander, that he was bringing his fleet out of the West Indies, not to New York, but to the Chesapeake Bay. And so in August of that year, Washington and Rochambeau decided to leave a few troops in New York to try to fool the British, and then they marched south for a rendezvous with Cornwallis at Yorktown. You'll recall that the British in 1778 had shifted to what they called a southern strategy, where they moved their main base of operations into what they still considered the southern colonies, obviously the southern states. In December 1778, they captured Savannah. May of 1780, a year and a half later, they captured the key southern port of Charleston. As I mentioned, they had already been in possession of New York since 1776. So even though they had captured these three key cities, from their perspective, they were no closer to putting down this rebellion against British authority than they had been since the war started in 1775. From Washington's perspective, he needed a big knockout blow. The war had been going on at that point for 5.5 years. Morale was in decline. Support from the various states was running low in terms of money and supplies and men. He needed a big victory. So as Rochambeau and Washington moved south in August of 1781, Washington needed a big knockout blow in Virginia against Cornwallis. So Washington and Rochambeau lead their army south. They get to Virginia in September, where they rendezvous with Admiral de Grasse, who has brought his fleet out of the West Indies. He ferries the French and American troops down to Williamsburg. At this point, Cornwallis is pleading with Sir Henry Clinton in New York to send naval reinforcements, either to reinforce him or to evacuate him from the peninsula at Yorktown. Sir Thomas Graves sails out of New York with a smaller fleet than the French. He engages Rochambeau in what became known as the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. The French drive off the British ships. Graves goes back to New York, leaving Cornwallis cut off on the peninsula. Rochambeau and Washington lay siege to Yorktown over a series of days in October, and they basically starved Cornwallis's army out, so that by the 19th of October, Cornwallis thought he had no recourse left but to surrender himself and his entire army to General Washington and his French allies. This was a huge big deal. Washington had never accepted the surrender of a British army until that day. The British wanted a full military surrender. They wanted to march out with flags flying, bayonets gleaming. Washington refused. He offered the British the same terms the British had offered Benjamin Lincoln in Charleston in May of 1780. So the British had to march out with their flags furled and their muskets shouldered. They tried to surrender to the French. The French refused and made them surrender to the Americans, and Washington made them surrender to Benjamin Lincoln, who of course had to give up Charleston in May of 1780. Cornwallis feigned sickness that day. He did not come out to surrender. He sent out a subordinate, General Charles O'Hara. We are standing here in Colonial Park Cemetery in front of the grave of Lachlan McIntosh, the American general who was not at Yorktown. And the reason we're standing right here is because, of course, Charles O'Hara was taken prisoner of war by Washington, and O'Hara was eventually exchanged for Lachlan McIntosh, who had been captured in Charleston in May of 1780. When word got back to London of the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown, Lord North, who had been prime minister since 1770, for 12 years almost at this point, said the game is up, and negotiations began with the Americans at that point to end the American Revolution. It was the last major military engagement of the American Revolution, and in September of 1783, 2 years later, the Americans and the British signed the Treaty of Paris, effectively ending the American Revolution, and the United States became, once and for all, an independent country. As we commemorate this important date in American history, October 19th, 1781, 241 years ago. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for watching.